Hi, welcome to General Biology. My name is Jody Dillon. Um, I'm going to just introduce myself and then we'll go right into a discussion on Chapter 1. So, I have a Master's of Natural Science from SEMO. I studied insects, botany, ecology. I get to teach courses like this one, and I get to teach zoology, environmental science, botany, intro to bio, and a school health course. You can find me in my office on T31 on the second floor of the tech building. I have my syllabus that I'll be giving out to you guys in lab when we meet for the first time. So some of you guys will be meeting on Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning, and some of you guys will be meeting me on Wednesday at 9 o'clock in the morning. I posted here just some of the syllabus highlights. We will have a syllabus quiz, and I'll try to get that posted on my Mac. There is a chance that I might not get it posted on my Mac, and we would just do it face to face if that's the case. We are meeting so far. Things change day by day, it seems, with this COVID situation, but right now we are divided up into two groups as a class, and Group A will come to lab for the whole meeting time from 9 to 11:50 on Mondays, and Group B will come on Wednesdays at 9 o'clock. Our lecture, instead of listening to lecture online, on Fridays we're going to be Zoom lecturing, and that gives me an opportunity to actually just interact with you guys and just see how how much kind of material that you're getting and how you're processing it and things like that. Our exam components are not going to come from like these lectures or anything like that. They're really exam components that we do in our lab activities. And so with that, you get to ask me questions because so far our labs are in person. Your exams, your lecture exams, and your lab practicals are also both going to be proctored in the lab since that is our face-to-face time. I'm not a huge fan of online exams. I just don't think that they're a true assessment of what you're learning as opposed to a true assessment of how well you can quickly look up information. In the lab, when we do meet for lab, we do not allow food or drinks. I don't allow food or drinks in the lab whatsoever, especially right now in these kind of uncertain times that we're experiencing. You are required to wear a mask this semester, and you're required to wear safety glasses in lab. I will tell you everything you need to know about safety when we're face to face in the lab doing lab activities and things like that. I'm not gonna kind of carry on about it today. This course is not a difficult course in content, but the course is definitely a little challenging with regards to volume. So what you'll find in general biology is that it's not such a hard thing to have, but it really is just a lot of stuff coming at you at once. So there's a lot of material in every unit, and you are really required to manage your time well. You should take notes. If I say anything super cool, and it might happen, take some notes. I give a ton of kind of simplistic analogies that are really designed to help you as you go along. Definitely watch the videos that I post and listen to these recorded lectures. I cannot stress that enough. Reading a PowerPoint as opposed to watching a PowerPoint that has voice recordings on it where I'm elaborating on some of these notes, that's going to be the only thing that's going to get you by. And not to mention, make sure that you're studying throughout the week, every week. Don't wait until the night before the exam to study. You can't expect yourself to memorize, 4 weeks of material in a night. That's not fair to you, and I don't think that you would enjoy that. So we go right along into chapter 1. So chapter 1 is really just kind of an overview of what is biology, and it kind of introduces you to a few things that you could learn along the way. Um, Life sciences, biology is a life science, and so some of those things that you'll um, experience, some of the careers that you can gain from having a foundation of life sciences. You can um, study medicine, you can study nursing, zoology, botany, anatomy, physiology, genetics, things like that nature. Um, Biology itself is really all about the study of life. So when you're a biologist, you study living things. That is how it works. So um, essentially, you study, everything from the smallest atom all the way up to the biosphere itself. All living things share common characteristics. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what is a living thing? Like, how do you even know what a living thing is? And that's because living things they really all kind of have the same things in common. Um, they're well ordered, they reproduce and develop, that's a must. They acquire materials and energy, they're also respondent to their environment, they maintain homeostasis, and they adapt and evolve as well. So, essentially, everything in life is very orderly and structured. You wouldn't think that, but it really is. Everything that's living is made of one or more cells, and those cells work together um, in many cases to work as functioning tissues. And we love order. We're dependent on structure and order. Um, Not just that things are generally ordered, but when for example, if you look in my closet, you would definitely see some order in my shoes, my clothes, how I hang my shirts. It's kind of a must. The second thing that all living organisms share and have in common is the ability to reproduce and develop. Not just the ability, but like the requirement to reproduce and develop. So, living organisms pass genes from parent to offspring, and they do that in various methods. Obviously, sexual reproduction is one method where genes are combined from parents, and asexual reproduction is another way that organisms reproduce and develop. So they are required to reproduce, obviously, to maintain a population. Um, their growth and development is determined by inherited DNA. So this is not the first time you're going to hear me say DNA. I say DNA often throughout the semester, you can imagine. So DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the thing that has all the genetic information that you have in your body. It's the thing that determines everything about you. And that information is it's genetic. It's in your genes. When you hear, oh, how do you get that trait? Well, it's genetic. It's an inherited trait. So DNA has all the genetic information that all living organisms share. The third thing that all living organisms have in common is the ability or the need to acquire materials and energy. So they do that. They require energy sources to power metabolism, which is basically all the chemical reactions that happen in a cell. So you have to be able to have energy to maintain cellular function. Your body cannot run, and all living things, not just people, but plants as well, cannot operate and power the metabolic systems that they have without some energy source. And I mentioned plants, but it is important to know that the sun is the ultimate source of energy for all life on Earth. Without the sun, our plants can't photosynthesize, and without those photosynthesizers, they can't create the required carbohydrates that we need, and the things that we need, of course. So the sun is the ultimate source of energy for life on Earth. Living organisms also respond to environment. That's a requirement. Obviously, if you've ever just surviving is requires that you have the ability to respond to environmental stimuli. Imagine yourself like touching something really hot. Do you leave it on that hot surface? Like if your hand touches the hot burner, do you have the ability to think about it and, oh, this is very hot. Yeah, this doesn't feel good. I think I shall move it now. No, you respond immediately. Like you respond to that hot surface, maybe even before you think about it. Living organisms do that. They also are required to maintain some level of homeostasis. So, homeostasis just means like balance, a state of biological balance. So, um, that is, controlling some kind of internal environment within limits that sustain life. And this sounds really scientific, but think about what happens if you exercise and you get super, super hot. Typically, you sweat, right? That's your body's way of cooling yourself down to just remain within that comfortable temperature that your body can function. Or, if your blood pressure increases, your body is going to have some systemic way to reduce that blood pressure, and that's just how living things must behave, just to make sure that they're surviving in a comfortable state of biological balance. The sixth thing that all living characteristics have in common and that they share is the ability to adapt and evolve per se, and it happens over many generations. Um, where you'll see individuals that have the best traits that are suited to their environment will have the greater ability to reproduce. And if you have those best traits that allow you to thrive in your environment, those are going to be the most successful organisms because they're going to be able to reproduce and they're going to be able to produce offspring that they can pass those traits on, and those traits help their offspring survive. Um, and those offspring that have greater survival chances are fit. They're considered to be fit for their environment, and then they get to pass on their genes and so on and so forth. We mentioned adaptation and, adapting to an environment, and that brings us to like a very small bit on evolution. So, um, evolution is just the ability to evolve and change over time. And that really explains why there's such diversity among living organisms and also some sort of unity too, where we see these things that living organisms have in common. Populations do evolve over time. Individuals don't evolve, but they do pass on adaptive traits, right? There's no goal or desire. It's not like a fish was like, you know what? I'm not really feeling this water situation. I think I'll go live on land. It's really just environmental pressures that drive these evolutionary traits. Um, and a lot of times when we think about evolution, we also have to think about natural selection. So when you see natural selection, that's a Darwin adapted theme where he studied the Galapagos Islands and organisms that lived on the Galapagos Islands. And what he found was that there were several indicators towards the thought of natural selection, or that mutations happen when there are environmental stresses that cause them. And really, those mutations drive adaptations to environmental changes. Another kind of very important concept that we talk about so much are cells. So cells are the basic unit of life. They are the basic unit of structure and function for living organisms. They are responsible for regulating our internal environment. They respond to stimuli. Cells develop and maintain organization, and they give rise to new cells. We talk about cells at length in this class. When I have my face-to-face class, I've actually had students do a daily count of how many times I actually say the word cell, and it is a lot. Um, Cells, when you think about living organisms have emergent properties that you can see at the cellular level. Atoms are not living. When we refer to atoms, we know that they are not living things. Um, but cells are the basic unit of structure and function. And you can see organisms, whole entire organisms that are single-celled, like bacteria or protozoans. There's some algae. Many organisms are multicellular, where you'll see billions of cells that work in cooperation with one another. When we talk about emergent properties, we talk about, um, you know, properties and traits that arise at each level of life. We said that living organisms are organized and they are in order, and that's because you'll see, like, you'll have a cell, and then a cell will come together to form a tissue that will come together to form an organ, and you see these emergent properties based on this level of organization. And that's where you see this hierarchy of organization, because we know organisms are in order, and so we see like the cell, the tissue, the system. You'll see the organ system, the organism, so that's the whole individual, the population, the community, um, and really the biosphere is the most vast category, the most vast level of organization. If you look at the bottom level of organization, I mentioned, um, living organisms are in order, and you'll see the very smallest and minute level of biological organization is the atom. And then it gets a little more complex, and you'll see the molecule. It gets a little more complex than that when you'll get the cell, which is the structural and functional unit of all living organisms. And then they go together to form tissues and organ systems and organs, things of that nature. So, because we like order and things in science are in order, you'll see many times scientists will classify living things. It is the only way that you can basically differentiate or group common things together, and it's really a way of organizing scientific relationships too. So there are systems of studying and classifying living things like taxonomy, where you're naming and grouping organisms, or systematics, which are focusing on evolutionary relationships. When we study taxonomy and we study biological organization, we look at what's called a biological hierarchy. So if you look at the image on this screen, you'll see that the most vast level of organizing living organisms is the domain level. So if you can classify a whole lot of stuff by domain. That's the most inclusive category. You get a little bit more narrowed down, and you see kingdom, a little more narrow, the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, which looks at the very specific individual that you have. And all of these are categorized by scientific names. We have common names for a lot of organisms, which I always forget a common name. Like I'll see a plant in the woods and I'll be like, oh, that's fantastic. And I'll have the scientific name for the plant, but I will not remember the common name for the plant. It happens all the time. easy to remember the biological hierarchy, and I would remember it for an exam just as I would remember all of the living characteristics of organisms. Um, it's easy to remember this as well by domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So you can use this handy little dead kings play chess on fat gorilla stomachs acronym to remember this hierarchy. So when we look at domains, there are three domains identified and classified now. So there's bacteria, which we know a whole lot about, and it's a very hot topic to study just because bacteria affect us in a lot of ways. Um, and archaeans, those, if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see that bacteria and archaea are labeled as prokaryotes. So what that means is prokaryotes do not have a membrane-bound nucleus, and it's huge that you remember that. Prokaryotes have no membrane-bound nucleus. Eukarya does have a membrane-bound nucleus, so the domain eukarya are eukaryotes. So we focus a lot on the kingdoms of eukarya because obviously eukarya is us. We have a membrane-bound nucleus. So many of these kingdoms of eukarya include the kingdom Plantae, Animalia, fungi, and the protists, which we get to look at some protists in lab. We'll look at some um, members of Animalia in lab. We'll look at some members of Plantae in lab. You'll get to have a lot of experience with that. When you focus on phylum, you'll see individuals that are grouped from the same kingdom. So, like the phylum Chordata, everybody in Chordata has a spinal cord. The phylum Magnoliophyta, everybody in this phylum has flowering plants. Or arthropods, that's the phylum with jointed feet, limbs, like insects, right? Or my tarantula that I have at home. Individuals in class share many features, um, and that's why they're organized together, like the reptiles or the insects. Members in the category of order, those are very specifically grouped with noticeable shared features, like Cholocerata, Coleoptera, or the beetles, which are my favorite insect order, or the pine trees, Pinales. Individuals in a family share features and recognizable traits. So when we look at wildlife biology, we really focus on the family level. So like um, Rosaceae, like the rose family, or even, um, you know, when we look at very specific, like Dectes, my favorite insect. Genus would be very closely related evolutionarily. So, like canine, feline, lilium, these are all recognized genus. Species is the unique organism that separate from other organisms. So when we identify a species, we use binomial nomenclature. So that means we get to use two names that are typically in Latin to identify this individual, and it's a unique identifier. No other organism can be classified with name. So when I talk about my very favorite longhorned beetle, Dectes texanus, there's no other beetle that looks like Dectes texanus. It is the individual, like Jody Dillon is the individual. When we name species, we use very specific rules, like it's in italics, it's Latin, it is the genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, um, and we follow a lot more specific rules. And these are things, if you're ever writing a thesis and you forget one day to use the proper naming rules, your advisors are going to get you on it. When we look at organization of the biosphere, we really, and we have more of a focus on this later on in the semester where we look at chemical cycling and energy flow. We get into this when we get into the ecology unit, which I like a lot. We study communities, interactions, we study ecosystems, biomes. We cover this way more in depth in chapter 46. We study the human effects on ecosystems as well, and we get into this a lot in the ecology unit. I even like to get into climate change just a little bit. The bigger thing, and one of the so when you look at this lecture, the most important parts of these lectures include the levels of biological organization, what makes a living thing, and then also the scientific method. These are the critical components of this lecture that you will be expected to know for a lecture exam, okay? Which I do identify these things in your like unit study guides that I have posted on my Mac, but it's super important to know the scientific method. It's not perfect, but it is a critical process to understanding science. It allows us to um, support or reject a hypothesis, and it really allows us to evaluate information that we are not so sure of in a more objective manner. So um, scientists are always looking at new evidence and new studies. Obviously, that's super important right now. If you think about it, a global pandemic is happening right now in our generation, and science has never been more important. So, with that, we need to also understand nothing is ever proven in science. Someone somewhere in another place could do the same experiment that you did and get completely different results for a multitude of reasons. So the scientific method itself is super critical. We study that in lab, and it is a process of understanding natural phenomenon using objective empirical data. So you first make observations, you hypothesize, you draw conclusions, supporting and rejecting that hypothesis, and then you repeat the experiment. So I would be familiar if I were a student in Ms. Dillon's general biology to the steps of the scientific method. So step one, observation, which we will go over this in lab lots and lots. Um, the next thing you have to do is hypothesize. So you make a prediction, you experiment using a test that is a true test of your hypothesis, and you come to a conclusion where you either repeat the experiment, you accept or reject the hypothesis, and make your conclusions. Hypotheses are not just like random ideas, although we probably mentally go through the scientific method a ton of times in our lives, just in everyday issues, um, because we say a lot of, if I do this, then this will happen, but not always. Um, we have it, there's a ton of instances like, why doesn't my car start? Well, you have all kinds of ideas of why. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe you're out of gas, maybe the starter needs replaced. Um, what we really mean when we say I have a theory is, you know, theories are not just hypotheses, they are not the same at all. They are many hypotheses that are supported with evidence and over and over and over again, lots of collection evidence to say this is a theory. We never prove anything in science. We're always open to new evidence. when we talk about data collection, and we're going to do a ton of data collection in lab, there are two types of data. There's qualitative, which are descriptions, we use our senses, color, texture, taste, that kind of thing. And then there's quantitative, and that's numerical data. That involves statistical analyses, that's counting, height, weight, volume. We need to know the difference because sometimes in lab I'll ask you for qualitative data versus quantitative data. We also need to understand two types of reasoning, which is critical in the scientific method. So there's inductive reasoning, where you're looking at generalizations, you have a ton of observations, or there's deductive reasoning, and that's if-then statements. So it can be general to specific. If, like, for example, if the clouds are dark, then it will rain. That's deductive reasoning. And we really use both reasoning processes to collect our data. When you're going to test your hypothesis, you need to have a very good experimental design. It needs to be one that is repeatable. It has to have control variables, and they can be positive or negative controls. We talk a ton about this when we look at Lab 3, which we'll get to. It's a ton of fun. It requires that you have a good experimental design will test your hypothesis and give you results. So you're going to have an experimental variable, which is the independent variable. We call that the IV. That's the factor being tested. It is not changed. And then you have the responding variable, which is often called the dependent variable, or the DV, and that's what's being measured, and the DV always gets changed by the experimental variable. We'll see this in class. I'm going to ask you a ton about this in lab. The control for your experimental design is not exposed to the experimental variable, and that allows you to compare. A good experiment always has a control that you can compare to. When you refer to a scientific theory, you're looking at scientific studies that are published in peer-reviewed journals, and it's looked at and critiqued by other scientists. Some hypotheses are indeed supported with a ton of evidence and don't need tested. Eventually considered scientific theories, but theories are only supported by large evidence and in multiple disciplines and studies. Laws are quite different from theories because there's overwhelming support. Remember, science is never proven, but overwhelming support that this is the way life is. Like the law of gravity. I test it all the time, never fails. Always support the law of gravity. Science is super social. Good science is shared and can be repeated. It wasn't always that way back in the day when scientists were fighting for recognition. We talk a ton about this when we talk about DNA and some of the discoveries and the sketchy stuff that went down in DNA studies. Back then, we hid our data and we tried to be the first ones to be in the know about our research. Now we share our knowledge so that we can all learn. When we work on the scientific method in lab, we get to observe pill bugs. We will make hypotheses about what pill bugs are attracted to. We get to test and collect data over and over again. We get to compile that data and write it down and support and reject hypotheses. So it's going to be a ton of fun, that specific. You're responsible for reading all labs carefully before you come to class. When we do our lab activities, they are due at the end of the lab. Some of the labs do require lab reports, not often, but some, and I'll always explain when that is.